Good afternoon, everybody. So if you haven't heard from me before, I'm the Director of Workforce Development Core, and we're very pleased to have Dr. LaMonte yet again present on a different topic today. And what I would like to emphasize for the scholars is that Dr. LaMonte is going to give you a 90-minute overview of the topic of how to critique the literature. This is a tiny, tiny keyhole into the large area of science and research that we all do. So don't expect that you're going to become an expert today, but if this topic excites you and you want to learn more, please follow up with Dr. LaMonte or any of us here on the team to learn about other opportunities that exist either through CTSI or other UB opportunities where you can advance your knowledge. So today, we're going to hear a condensed and exciting story, but there are many other opportunities that you can take advantage of through the CTSI training. And regardless what you select to do, please remember to send us your evaluation forms that Catherine's going to send you afterwards. We take it very seriously, and we'd like to hear from you, hear your feedback, so that we can design new workshops and improve the existing workshops to address your needs and interests. Thank you very much. And the stage is open for Dr. LaMonte.
Well, thank you, Katia and colleagues, for that generous introduction, and I appreciate being a part of the workshop again. And I just want to echo one thing that Katia said. Even though this is being recorded and I have my email address on the slide, if you go back to look at the recording, or if you're just thinking about something we said today and you want to reach out to me, by all means, please just shoot off an email. We can either correspond that way. We could set up a Zoom. You can come down to the BERD at the CTSI for a meeting. But I just want you to know we're available for continued engagement long after we do the series, the workshop series and the videos. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. Just give me a moment. Here we go. Anyways, I'm going to talk a little bit about reading literature. By the way, and I don't mean this at all to be, well, this is the way to do it. Certainly not. I'm just trying to highlight a few key points from my own experience. And I'm sure we all could probably get together in an open room and just have discussion about how you go about reading, taking notes, referring back to. So by all means, there's more than one way to skin this cat for sure. So I'm going to just start with a little entree. So in 2002, the National Institutes of Health ended prematurely a major randomized clinical trial on menopausal hormone therapy with the primary prevention of cardiovascular disease as the beneficial endpoint. And there was awareness that there would be a likely increase in breast cancer risk as an adverse endpoint. What happened was, as the trial proceeded, the Data Safety and Monitoring Board realized that the risks were outweighing the benefits. And by about 5 years on average of a planned 8-year follow-up, they decided that it was in the best interest of the participants to terminate the trial. So this press release was given in July of 2002, and this paper that is on the right side of the screen was published in JAMA somewhere in the fall, early winter time of 2002. And this paper is where the scientific summary of the trial and what led to the NHLBI stopping the trial was found. So in a very short period of time, we went from a trial that had a lot of publicity to bring a definitive answer around the issue of should postmenopausal women begin using hormone therapy in the form of estrogen opposed by progestin for primary prevention of cardiovascular disease and other possible benefits. And trial gets stopped, and you can imagine there was a lot of fallout from that. Up in the left panel of the slide, you can see within 1 year of the WHI stopping, there was a precipitous decrease in prescription of hormone therapy, estrogen and progestin. So Premarin and Prempro would have been the brand names at the time. And Wyeth, by the way, the pharmaceutical company that made Premarin and Prempro, they had a near parallel decline in their stocks after the WHI was stopped. There was a lot of public concern raised. Time magazine is one, but several of the news outlets were covering the story. And within about 2 years of the trial stopping, there was immediate practice guideline changes avoiding the initiation of menopausal hormone therapy, which for many years prior to this trial stopping and the release of the unexpected harmful effects, prior to that, menopausal hormone therapy was being used by about 33% of postmenopausal women in the US. So it was a highly used substance, and the trial and the results, of course, changed that on many fronts. And this was an interesting article, and this is going to lead me into the discussion I want to have today. There was so much being put out around this time frame, 2002 to 4, shortly after, and some of it was scientific dissemination, like the JAMA article I highlighted, where the primary outcome results were published. Others were more lay writings, like Time magazine, that they do try and use at least somewhat accurate summaries of scientific information and writing those stories. And so this article really asked the question, was the dissemination and the translation of those findings accurate? And I'm not going to get into the findings of this article or take a position on whether or not it was accurate. But this is a good segue for us to think about in the consumer space. And we as scientists belong in that consumer space. We read other scientific literature. We publish our own scientific literature. From time to time, we may give sound bites to news media. We may talk to community groups. So various levels of dissemination. But if you step back, there's not one that's any more or less important than the other when it comes to accuracy. And so that's going to lead me to what I want to talk about today. How do we read scientific literature as a consumer, whether we're wearing our scientific hats or we're wearing more of a lay perspective, and understand whether or not what's in the writing is giving us the information we need, first of all, and whether we have a sense of its accuracy or not. And so I just jotted down a few things here. Now, I'm going to give us an example momentarily. In fact, I believe you were emailed by Liz prior to today's meeting, prior to today's Zoom call, the article I'm going to use as the example. So hopefully you will have gotten that as a PDF and you can follow along. And these are just, again, some of Mike's thoughts around what am I thinking about when I read a paper. Now, I'm speaking specifically to a scientific writing. So I think the title's critical. We may think the title's just somewhat trivial, but it really tells the story we're trying to tell for us right at the top of the first page. Now, one other thing I want to say as a caveat. For those of you who are actively involved in publishing scientific information in your area, I realize that some of what I may say today may not conform specifically to a specific journal. Journals have taken more control over how scientific manuscripts are written than ever before. And I'll get to some of that control aspect towards the end of this discussion. But I do think that, within the scope of the limitations imposed by the journal you're trying to submit your manuscript to, the title is very important. The introduction section is also very important because that sets the table for us. It should compel you from the first word in the introduction to the very last sentence of that section, which, by the way, should be the statement of the question or hypotheses being addressed in the article. You should be able to know what their hypothesis is and pretty much what they're going to tell you in the method section before you get there, if the introduction is written well and concisely. And again, going back to the idea of journals imposing constraints on us, most journals now have page limits or character limits. Some even specify lengths of the introduction, the methods, results, and discussion section, number of tables, and so on. So most of us would find we want to write a very compelling introduction, but we also don't want to waste too much of our page space or character count on the introduction itself. So we're trying to get at a few important issues. What is the underlying issue that raises the rationale for the study being proposed, and why is it relevant? And often that is pointing us to gaps in the scientific literature. What needs to be addressed? Is there a controversy somewhere? Is there a complete void of evidence that you're trying to begin filling? And through building this argument of what is the issue and why is it relevant, again, at the end of the introduction, a really well-written paper should have some statement of either the research question or the aims of the paper or the hypotheses being tested. Once you know what the article is intending to tackle, the next section of the paper, which is the methods, should be a very logical and sequential description of how they went about tackling that problem. And keep in mind, if you were with me the first workshop I did in this series, it'd be maybe 3 weeks ago, I took a few slides at the beginning to talk about the scientific method being somewhat of a systematic process that we try and use as closely as possible in terms of the steps through that process. And one of the big reasons science has systematic progress through it or progression through the steps is for replication. So when somebody's reading the methods of a study in a scientific article, no matter how much of the page space, number of pages or number of characters in the overall article are allocated to the methods, in theory, that should give somebody enough to begin developing another study to try and replicate the findings that are being reported here. So some of the things we want to know about are listed here. I'm going to go through each of these, by the way, in the example we'll work through here in a few minutes. The results section, again, is an area in papers where you kind of have to choose between lots of detail and balancing, giving enough evidence to support the results, but not going overboard. And journals help us now because most of the higher and middle tier journals will impose upon us a number of tables or a number of figures as maximum. But what most journals now do is they allow us to use online only supplemental files. And in there, you can have a lot of additional data and even in some instances, additional methodology that you couldn't write on or present in the main paper, but it provides critical understanding for the consumer. And then the discussion. Now, just like the introduction, I think the discussion is one of the most important parts of a scientific manuscript, and it's probably where art usurps science. There is an art to writing a good discussion. The more you read science, the more you find somebody who you really like the way they write, chances are one of the things you might identify as a skill they have that you like is the artfulness of the discussion. It flows like prose, and so we'll look at that here in a minute. But there are some key things that we want to see in a discussion, I think, and I'll point those out here as we move forward. So this is the paper that I sent, or I had asked Liz to send before our meeting today, and hopefully you got a copy of it. Now, I'm an epidemiologist, so I'm going to use an epidemiological paper to provide some of the examples and points for discussion that I'd like to highlight. Obviously, if you're not an epidemiologist, but you're involved in science in some other space, then hopefully the generalities I speak of here would apply to reading the scientific disseminations in scientific journals or meetings, abstracts, what have you, in your own field of interest. This is an article I use in several classes I teach, mostly around the idea of research methods, study design, these sorts of things. It was published a while ago, 1985, in the New England Journal of Medicine, which is still a very, very prominent journal, very, very challenging to write for because they impose critical limitations on overall length of articles, tables, figures, etc. But I like this article as an example because it really addresses each of the things I had in that previous summary box, which we'll go through now. So the title, here's the title of the article: A Prospective Study of Postmenopausal Estrogen Therapy and Coronary Heart Disease. So just by reading the title, could you answer these three questions? What is being studied? Who or in whom is the study conducted? And can you tell what the type of study it is? I think the answer, hopefully, is yes to all three. What is being studied? Postmenopausal estrogen therapy and coronary heart disease. In whom? Postmenopausal women. What type of study? As an epidemiologist, and perhaps some of you that are involved in clinical science would recognize, prospective study is a very specific kind of observational study. So I know this isn't a randomized trial. I know it's not a cross-sectional. I know it's not a case control. I know it's a prospective cohort study. So that title packs a big punch. And it's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 words. The next part of the main manuscript would be the introduction part. And again, the introduction is really there to whet the appetite and put the hook of intrigue in the reader or the consumer. It should clearly bring forward what is being studied, what's the issue, why is it important, or why is it relevant, and then it should give a statement of the problem. Now, in the New England Journal, and I use again this article for this purpose, you have very limited space. So it's almost like every sentence, every word really has to be conveying something important. And I think this introduction, which is clipped out of the article exactly here, this is as long as it is, does a great job with that. So right off the bat, they get at the issue. The role of exogenous estrogens, menopausal hormones, in coronary heart disease has been what? Controversial. So they're saying there's controversy in the scientific literature. First sentence, they put it in our face that they have something they've identified that needs more investigations. They go on to tell us a little bit about what's known regarding risk of coronary heart disease in pre versus postmenopausal women, and that there is some belief that estrogen, the hormone, might have some benefit on risk factors that are associated with this disease. They also go on to say that there was a previous case control study, which is a slightly different study design than they're using, that showed there might be elevated risk rather than benefit on coronary disease in women who used estrogens. But several recent studies found the opposite, an inverse association or a suggestion of benefit. So there is the controversy. And notice they're using citations very judiciously here, and they're pointing the readers to where the evidence for these statements of fact can be found in the published literature. Now, why is this important? So they take maybe 4 sentences to make a point of what the issue is and the background surrounding the controversy, and now they hit us with another punch by telling us why this is important. Because in the US, 2 to 3 million women were using this agent. And if there's an unknown relative to or a controversy relative to this agent, it could affect a large number of women in this age range, postmenopausal, in the US. So this is a big issue. That's what they're trying to say here. And they go on to say, because there's so many women using this, even a small relationship between the hormone and, in this case, coronary heart disease, might have important public health consequences. So over those sentences, ending with the word country, they tell us what the issue is. They use 10 citations to support their statements with fact in the published literature. They tell us why it's relevant. And the introduction ends with a therefore. So this is what the issue is. This is why it's important. Therefore, the purpose of our study was, or what they said, therefore, we examined. This is a beautifully written introduction, in Mike's humble opinion. Very concise, very compelling, and supported by lots of publications, ergo facts that they're using to support their statements of building the relevance. So we read the introduction. Now, we get to that point where they say, we therefore examine. So this is what we're going to do, Mr. Reader. What do you expect the very next thing should be in their paper? If they tell you, here's the issue, here's what we're going to do, what would be the next thing you'd think you'd want to see as you're reading? If we're thinking about the scientific method, that progress of telling the story. Hopefully you're thinking along the same lines as I would, is I want to know how you're going to do this. You told me what you're going to do, now tell me how you're going to do it. And that's exactly what should follow next in a scientific manuscript, and that would be the method section. And what the method section should do is it should tell us the study protocol with enough detail that at least the opportunity to begin thinking about replication is possible. If you read a method section of a scientific paper, and at the end of reading it, you're scratching your head saying, I have some idea of what they did, but I'm not exactly sure how they did A or how they did B or C, then I would question how well that method section was written. At least on the basis of scientific communication is not just about giving a problem and results, but the communication should also clearly give the picture of what was the methodology used, what was the recipe used to bake the cake, so to speak, and could you replicate it in your own bakery following my recipe? So let's see what they told us here. Well, they told us that this population of postmenopausal women came from a study called the Nurses' Health Study. Some of you may recognize that. It's a very long established and continuing today study of women's health in the US. It was established in 1976. How did they establish it? They sent questionnaires out to all female registered nurses in this age range who were living in one of 11 large US states. And then there's a citation here we could go and look at that gives us more detail on the sampling frame. Okay. So these are US registered nurses. What we would find in this citation is that at that time, the registry of US registered nurses was public domain. So it's kind of like going into the phone book and identifying a group of people you want to contact and invite to be in your study. They chose registered nurses and had access to the registry of these individuals that they could then mail these letters to and the questionnaire. They tell us that, excuse me, here it is. A total of 121,000 plus completed and returned a questionnaire. Now, I'll tell you that in this citation, we would find out they mailed 170,000. So for those of us who think about response rate, while they didn't actually tell us what it was, if we know they mailed out 170,000, we know they got 121,000 back, they basically had around a 70% response. Back in this time period, in the early 80s, that was actually considered to be quite a good response to a mailed questionnaire. The questionnaire was repeated again in 1978 and 1980. Okay? And they asked pretty much the same information again. Now, they tell us about the population. We want to also know, how did you assess the variables that you're going to report on? So the independent variable, or from an epidemiologist's way of thinking, the exposure variable in this study is the hormone use. So I want to know, how did you determine a woman was a hormone user or non-user, or maybe they were a former user and quit, and so on and so forth? And they tell us on the 1976 questionnaire, the women were asked simply, had you used postmenopausal hormones? And if they used it, for how long? Okay. And then they tell us how they define current user, so that we have this kind of working construct. They tell us a little bit about the duration of use and how they operationalized it for the purposes of analysis. And they also tell us that they repeated the question on hormone use in 1978 so that they were able to have updated information on hormone use in this postmenopausal population of women. So they're not relying on a single assessment, but they use two assessments separated by 2 years to define the independent variable. One thing we learned from reading this is hormone use is completely based on self-report. They didn't look at medication bottles, i.e. a medication inventory. They didn't look at, nowadays we could use CMS or Medicaid information to look at prescriptions. They basically asked the women. Now, thinking about who these women were, though, this is a cohort of nurses. They're medical professionals. Do you think that there might be an advantage in defining an epidemiological cohort to study women's health over time, and as your study, enroll women who are working in the medical profession? In fact, that was one of the motivations. It was intended for that reason when they developed the nurses' health study, to do it in nurses as opposed to trying to use a community sample of women. Their argument was they wanted this group of nurses to stay connected to the study for many, many years to come. And they wanted to have some assurance that they understood the questions they were being asked. And when they gave a response, they were probably going to be more accurate than if it was a community-based sample where people may not understand terminology or have the motivation to be connected as these nurses might have, because it's what they did for a living. So while they don't have more objective assessments of hormone use, the independent variable independent variable by self-report is coming from a group or set of participants where you would expect the ability to report this accurately to be high. The dependent variable in this study, or the outcome variable, we know is coronary heart disease. Now, in epidemiological study and in randomized trial literature, there should be a fair amount of attention given to describing how the outcome or the dependent variable is defined. Saying coronary heart disease alone doesn't cut the mustard, because coronary heart disease is a very broad category of ischemic heart disease and a broader category under cardiovascular disease. So as you see here, they let us know explicitly the endpoints for the study were two: non-fatal myocardial infarction or heart attack, and fatal coronary heart disease. So death due to anything that was presumed to be of ischemic coronary disease in nature. Now, again, these are nurses who on the questionnaires are saying, yes, I've had a heart attack. And of course, if it's fatal, we'll talk about here in a minute how they got the fatal events. But for the non-fatal events, again, this is a group of medical professions, so you probably have some assurance that they're not mixing up angina or having a stent put in with actually having a heart attack. And the participants were asked to give permission for the investigators to go and get their medical records so that the investigators could review each reported case and verify it. And it says here, an incident case was considered confirmed if it occurred, yada, 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 and was verified in the medical record. Based on what, Mike? Based on a standard definition, which at the time was the World Health Organization definition of heart attack. And they reference what that is if we want to go look it up. So this is just a few sentences and a citation, but they overview how did they define, collect, and verify the non-fatal heart attacks. In terms of the other part of their outcome variable, the fatal events, they tell us how they went about identifying the deaths. And they tell us some of it came from next of kin, some came from postal authorities where there was returned postal mailings and they found out the person had deceased. They went on to say that the deaths were considered to be due to coronary disease if, and then they tell us what their criteria was. If there was clearly defined heart attack from the hospital record or from an autopsy that had been performed. And then they tell us a little bit else about how they got the information in the community that they were surveying. And they tell us here that all reviews were conducted by experienced physicians, and the physicians didn't know the status of the participant on any of the other variables. They didn't know, were they a hormone user, yes or no. Maybe that might skew their review of the case if they, in their mind, thought there was a connection between hormone use and death. And if they knew someone was a hormone user, they might inadvertently or advertently call it a coronary death when in fact it may not be. So having blinded reviewers is very important, and they tell us that's what they did. And because there was the possibility of two things happening to a person, they let us know that they could only be counted for one endpoint in the analysis. So someone who had a heart attack first and then died of heart disease would only have been counted for one event, not for both of them. So a few things that they don't tell us about. It would have been nice to know what the level of agreement was between the self-reported cases of heart attack and what the adjudication showed when they applied the World Health Organization. Was the agreement 90%, which would be great? Most of the time when a nurse said they had a heart attack, there was evidence in their medical record to support that. Was the agreement really poor? 50%. Okay. The same with the fatal events. And you like to see that in articles. And I think that's a very important part, at least in clinical trials and in observational epidemiology, where disease events are the outcome. We need to know what percentage of agreement is there between the observed event and the adjudication itself. The other thing they don't tell us in either of these is what was the completeness? Did they have complete understanding of vital status, so the deaths? Did they have complete understanding of heart attack, or were they missing return questionnaires? And if so, how many were missing? Is there the possibility that there is a bias here because of missing information? I would have liked to seen that here myself, but otherwise, I thought the discussion of the dependent variable was reasonably well detailed and didn't leave a whole lot of questions in my mind, notwithstanding what I just mentioned. Obviously, another important part of scientific articles, particularly when there's hypothesis testing being completed and reported, is we need to know what statistical procedures were used. We don't have to be statisticians, but somebody with an informed set of eyes should be able to read the statistical section of an article and say, yeah, this seems reasonable to me, or this makes no sense at all. That's not the right statistical procedure for the kind of study or data that they have. So here, they tell us, beginning with this sentence, the primary analysis was based on. And they tell us a little bit about how they calculated incident rates of the outcome, coronary heart disease. And then they go on to tell us the time frame between which the questionnaire on hormone therapy had been administered and the time at which they were counting the cases of disease. That's what we call the follow-up interval. And the follow-up interval ended on May 31st, 1980. So they were counting cases of disease between 1976, 1978 questionnaires through May 31st, 1980. They tell us a little bit more about how they report their incident rate data. And then they go on to tell us that they used a specific statistical technique to do multivariable adjusted analyses. Now, again, this paper was published in the 1980s, and the idea of doing multivariable regression had just really started to become popularized. We kind of take it for granted now, at least our students in epidemiology do. They can push buttons and generate numbers, but often have no idea what it means. Nevertheless, we are much more advanced now. So the idea of telling us that this is what they did probably has a little bit of temporal or contemporacy to it back to the 80s when this study was done and this paper was published. But again, they also give a citation for somebody who wants to know what exactly this proportional hazards thing is. We could go look it up. And at least if we can't make a determination, have a statistical colleague tell us whether they thought this was appropriate or not. Okay, so after they tell us how they're going to go about doing the study, we should then come across the results section. And that's where we want to start understanding, well, what did you find? Many, I guess I can't say all, but at least in the kinds of scientific articles I'm most familiar with, whether they're observational or experimental, it's human subjects research. I don't do animal research. We often see some sort of a description of who the participants were. And in this instance, in this New England Journal article, it happened to be the first table where there is actually tabulated data reported in the article. And in this particular table, what the investigators are trying to give us a sense of, what are some of the participant characteristics, particularly those that are related to the outcome variable, having a heart attack or dying from coronary disease? What are some of the characteristics of the women according to the independent variable? whether they were a hormone user. And they broke the women up into never, ever, which means at some point they used hormones, but they weren't at the present time when they completed the questionnaire, or current users. And again, remember, this is self-reported off of a questionnaire. But they have three groups. And what we can see is how these characteristics distribute over the variable that we're interested in relating to the outcome. And what we would see is, if you're familiar with menopausal hormone, estrogen in particular, some things we would expect. Women who are current estrogen users were more likely to have been also a previous oral contraceptive user, which was a hormone-based preparation that had estrogen in it at the time. Women who were using estrogen at the time they filled out the questionnaire were less likely to be smokers. Smoking is a contraindication. Even back in the 70s and 80s, clinicians would be less likely to prescribe estrogen to smokers because smoking and estrogen interact to increase coagulability of the blood. So if nothing else, they'd ask the woman to stop smoking. It doesn't mean everybody did, but you can see the trend here is less current smoking among the current users. Not much of a relationship with hypertension, and so on and so forth. You can see how this goes. Quetelet's index, by the way, if you're interested, is what we currently today call BMI, body mass index. Quetelet is the guy that invented it. He used to get his name put in articles before people just generically called it BMI. So, table one, we get an understanding of who the participants are, and in this case, how these characteristics relate to the independent variable. So it's a starting place for us. We're in the results section. So they've described the participants to us. What do we want to see next? Well, I'd really like to start seeing results relating hormone use to the outcome, risk of coronary heart disease. And in fact, that's actually the second table in this article. The way they laid their table out, again, this is an epidemiological analysis. So in epidemiology, we often like to see things carved up into lots of different pieces. But here across the top row, you have the three main groups for the independent variable: never hormone users, ever, and current. And then what we see is how many cases of heart disease there are in each of the groups according to major age brackets. So what they're trying to show us here, is there any variation with having heart disease occur depending on which estrogen group you were? And then the last thing they show us in the table is an age standardized or a statistically age adjusted number of cases. And what they're doing ultimately is they're saying that this never group, they self-reported never being a user of menopausal estrogen. This is going to be our reference group. Everything else we look at in the study will compare back to these people. And so what they do then is they give us the relative risk, which is the incidence of coronary heart disease in the reference group divided into the incidence in the group of interest, the ever users in this case. And what we end up with is a relative risk of 0.5. So a 50% lower risk of having heart disease in the women who had reported ever being a user compared to the never users. And then they compared the current users, the women who, when they filled out the questionnaire, they said, I'm using it now. And what they end up with is an even stronger relationship, 0.3, which is a 70% lower risk of having heart disease compared to the never users. And so this 0.3 and this 0.5, if we think about what they told us in the introduction of this paper, this is the first piece of result they're showing us where we can make a determination: are their results more consistent with or are they contradicting rather the hypothesis? The hypothesis was that hormone use would be related to lower risk of heart disease. So these relative risks, 0.5 and 0.3, suggest that, in fact, there is a lower risk when you compare people who at some point used or people who were currently using against those who say they never used. So that's the first piece of result we have. Again, this is in the table. These are the table data. In the results text, they would be putting words around this and they would refer us to table 2 to see the actual numbers. Now, that's not all they did. Remember, they told us they were going to look at incident rates and they were going to compare the evers and the currents against the nevers. But they also said something about that multivariable approach in their statistical methods. Now, I'm sitting here looking at table 2, and the only thing I see is age. Where's the multivariable? If we were reading further in the paper, we would come across table 3. And you can see by the title of the table, they're telling us now we're giving the relative risk values after we adjust for all of that stuff that was in table 1, all of those characteristics. What we want to do is we want to know if when we compare the currents to the nevers and when we compare the past to the nevers, but we hold constant statistically all these other characteristics, do we still see a relationship? Or is the reason we saw the relationship in the other table, table 2, because there was a lot of this other characteristic stuff that's really driving the action? So the result they show us here is for the relative risk, comparing the current versus the never, after they control statistically for all these other characteristics, they got the same answer, 0.3. Just like in the previous table, which means there's a 70% lower risk of having heart disease or developing heart disease in the women who were current estrogen users compared to those who reported never using. And statistically, this p-value tells us that this is a statistical or statistically significant relationship. If we assume that the hypothesis test was conducted at a 0.05 alpha level, this p-value is less than 0.05. It's less than 0.05 by a lot. So this is a highly statistically significant finding. Interestingly, when they compare the past users, or the ever users, as they called them in the previous table, against the nevers, and now do this control or adjustment using statistics, they no longer have a significant finding. It's no longer 0.5. It got a little weaker. It's now 0.59, about 41% or so, 40% or so lower risk, but the risk isn't statistically significant anymore, which tells us that some of these factors are probably explaining the relationship in the previous table for the evers when compared to the nevers. So we go through the data. We go through the data tables. I've given you 3. I think there was one other, but it wasn't anything worth commenting on. And of course, you realize if you have the PDF of the paper, you can look at it. If not, let us know. We'll send it to you. But there's a results section too that corresponds to that table. So there's text giving us their interpretation of the results that I just remarked on the numeric values for. So the two go together, of course. So now, to me, as I said earlier, they told us what the issue is, they told us why it's relevant, and they told us what their question was in the introduction. They told us how they were going to do their study with sufficient detail that we might try and replicate it in the method section, and they gave us a summary of the key findings in the results. Beautiful. That is really what I like to think of as more conventional scientific writing. That's pretty straightforward, writing those sections. What we're looking at now, and what we'll finish with, is the discussion. And this is more, in my opinion, art. Why do I say that? Because now what the investigators have to do, they have to recapitulate the introduction and now convince us through an elegant discussion why their interpretation of the data, the results, and the implications thereof is correct. And these are areas of papers when I'm reading the science I read that I'm often most disappointed in. You know, it feels like it was just a half, attempt to write a discussion, but basically, let's get my paper published, as opposed to trying to really write an informed and thoughtful discussion that someone else can build off of. Or if somebody wants to write a letter to the editor and criticize them or challenge them, at least it's informed and thoughtful. So why do I think this was a good discussion? In a discussion, I think there's some very important elements. Many discussions will start with a sentence or two that restates the objective. Once that's done, then there's usually a summary of the main finding. The way they started their discussion is they did not restate the objective or the aim. Instead, they gave us a couple of sentences of what the main finding was. Current hormone users had a reduced rate of coronary heart disease compared to never users. That's the big finding here. I mean, that is really the big punch from this article. So as an epidemiologist, I'm reading that and I'm thinking, okay, I saw the numeric values, but now you got to convince me that those are accurate. They're not biased. It wasn't a chance finding. And that your findings contribute back to that controversy that you set the stage in the introduction by bringing to our attention. Remember, they said this is a controversial area. So let's see what they did to impress us. So first of all, they say the confidence intervals, if you're familiar with those, that's this bracket of values around the relative risk. This gives us an understanding of what the lowest possible value and the highest possible value is under some assumptions pertaining to chance. So they say the confidence intervals are relatively wide, reflecting some uncertainty about the actual magnitude. So what they're saying is, yes, on average, the relative risk is 0.3, but because of certain things, the sample size, maybe the number of cases weren't as large as needed, there's some wiggle room around that 0.30. Maybe it's only 0.14, but maybe it's as high as 0.64. But one thing we know of is this is a statistically significant finding based on this p-value, and I'll tell you what that means here momentarily. And that's actually the next thing they talk about. Chance is an unlikely explanation for the findings. Why? Again, it's because they achieve statistical significance. In a layman's way of looking at it, the hypothesis test was done and they rejected the null hypothesis that chance was the best or most likely explanation for their findings. So they've addressed chance using statistical hypothesis testing. So it's not likely just a chance finding. However, and this is one of the things I love about the paper, especially from an epidemiologist standpoint and from a teaching standpoint, they put right on the table, there are some other things that have to be considered. In other words, there's other things we need to convince you about as the reader so that you're less skeptical about our findings. And the two things they highlight is bias, error, you can think of error as bias, or confounding, other factors that actually explain the relationship, but weren't accounted for properly. Okay, so now they go through, and I'm not going to go through each line. Again, if you have the paper, you can read this. I'd encourage you to read it. It's a very well-written discussion. But they do start off by saying the design of the study itself, this prospective design, reduces the likelihood of certain biases. that are often problematic in case control studies. And remember in the introduction, they mentioned that some of the controversial data came from case control studies. And they're saying here, those studies may have biases associated with them. So basically they're saying we used a better design. We used a better design to try and overcome some of the limitations of previous designs. Then they go through and they want to tell us, okay, we're starting to try and convince you that this idea of bias and confounding isn't the big issue or the best explanation. We also have to try and convince you whether or not our findings align with or are way out in left field from other similar studies. And what they did, and again, from a teaching standpoint in epidemiology, I really appreciated this paper because in order to write their discussion, they went out and found the other 8 prospective studies that had been published up to date at the time, 1985. And you'll see why they did this in a minute. I will come back and tell you why explicitly they took the trouble to get all 8 of them. And they wanted to say something about all 8 of the other prospective studies that had been published. So these are studies that are designed like this one, overcome some of the other challenges from designs like a case control study or a cross-sectional study. So what did they find? They start calling out the studies by name, telling you a little bit about the women involved, and then they give you the relative risks that they found. And ultimately, what they're going to say is their findings, oops, excuse me, I didn't mean to click the thing. I cut off the entirety of this part of the discussion. It's a couple of big paragraphs. But if you go back and read this, what you will see them say is our findings are consistent with the relative risks. Remember, they showed 0.3. This study called the Lipid Research had a 0.4 and a 0.3 relative risk, depending on which outcome they looked at. They're going to conclude after reviewing all 8 of these studies in their discussion that our findings are consistent with, they don't say better than, they say consistent with the other like study designs. So now at this point in the discussion, and again, this part of the discussion would have gone on over a couple of long paragraphs. I just didn't want to have them all up here and waste the time going through them. You can read them yourself. But let me re-summarize where we are in the discussion. They started out with a statement of the main finding. They told us there's a little bit of imprecision based on their confidence interval. The actual relative risk might be a little smaller or a little bigger. But we know a couple things about it. We know it's not due to chance. Why? Because we did a hypothesis test and it was statistically significant. And because of the design they used, the biases that are often present in other designs, like a case control study, typically are not present here. So they're starting to convince us that these alternative explanations are not likely the best explanation for their finding. So now they get to what we have up on the screen now, and they're saying, well, let's see if we have something that's in the ballpark of what other people have found when they use the same design, and they conclude that they did. So now we know the results are starting to seem realistic. They're not likely prone to, large amounts of error. I don't think you ever know whether a result is completely error-free. And I don't know if there is such a thing as a completely error-free result, but they're trying to help us think through this systematically. So now what else would we want to know about this? Again, as an epidemiologist, and also I think in clinical trial literature, once we have some understanding that the effect or the association, the relative risk here, or the effect size in a clinical trial is plausible, it's not due to error, it's statistically significant. The next thing I think we want to know is there a biology under this? Does it make sense if we step away from the statistics and all the bells and whistles of the design? Does this just make sense biologically? And that's what they attacked then in the next part of the discussion. One of the plausible explanations, you can superimpose there, one of the biological explanations for our finding is, and they go on to talk about the different pathways that were suspected back in the 80s. Some of these we now know are correct, some are not correct, but influencing lipid levels was very well established at the time. And the biggest influences, for those of you that are women on the call, menopausal hormones, estrogens, keep your good cholesterol levels high. When you go through menopause and your naturally occurring estrogen production and secretion drops, your HDL cholesterol, your good cholesterol, drops along with it, and that makes you more susceptible for atherosclerosis in your coronary arteries. So they're saying that could be one of the mechanisms. And then they go on and talk about some others. So now, discussion section. They reiterated the main finding. They told us that the actual relative risk is a little uncertain, but it's significant from a statistical standpoint, not due to chance. It's not likely because of major biases. It's consistent with what other studies have found, and we have a biological rationale to support it. I mean, you're reading this now. When I first read it long ago, I'm getting excited. This is making good sense from an epidemiological standpoint. So what was the big deal? Is it just one of many others? Does this become the 9th paper on top of the other 8? This is the other part of the discussion where I think the art and the science intersect, and really good investigators know how to do this. And this is put it into some framework and make a statement about how this should inform the future research. Now, very, very carefully chosen words here. This is a high-level investigative group from Harvard. They're very, very well established back in the 80s and continue to be today. Look at what they say here. This is the final paragraph. I just cut out a little bit in between these sentences. The results of our study and others are consistent with what? It's consistent with a hypothesis they tested. They state that. Well, what was the hypothesis? That menopausal hormone reduces coronary heart disease risk. Boom. Now, they make a statement that brings the finding, or the findings, if you believe them, that the other investigations are consistent with theirs. They bring it into the practical clinical setting. A judgment, hey, clinicians, they're saying, about whether you should routinely prescribe must be tempered by consideration of the totality of risks and benefits. At the time this study was published, estrogen use was recognized to be a risk factor for endometrial cancer, and breast cancer was emerging behind this as well. So what they're saying is, we really don't know yet. This paper brings into context a possible benefit that seems to be emerging in the well-designed epidemiological studies. However, you can't rush out and start prescribing this because we're telling you it might benefit heart disease. We also have to consider the risks. And it's the last sentence of the paper that I highlight with red underline, that when I read this, I said to myself, I hope one day I'm smart enough to write like these people. They just put it on the table and said, you know what? We don't need any more observational data. We now probably have a critical mass of evidence to support consideration of the ethical and feasibility aspects of doing a randomized controlled trial. Now, I want to go back full circle to where I started. The Women's Health Initiative hormone trial that I started this slide set with and mentioned as a segue, it was stopped in 2002 because the hypothesis that hormone use would reduce heart disease risk was not supported. In fact, heart disease risk went up along with breast cancer. So the risks outweighed the benefits, and they stopped the trial. This publication, this 1985 publication, where this sentence, underlined in red, is the last sentence in the paper, was one of the major publications that brought together at the National Institutes of Health a committee that actually started planning the trial, and the trial was the Women's Health Initiative. So the observational studies, and this paper in particular, said there's controversy. Some evidence says it's good, some evidence says it's bad. We're going to try and add something to that with our data. But at the end of the day, they said, this is not the study design to adjudicate the controversy. We need a randomized trial. So the randomized trial was planned. It was fielded as the Women's Health Initiative, and it was stopped early because it didn't work the way everybody thought it was going to work. This paper has so much meaning beyond just an example of scientific writing, and looking at how carefully words were chosen, what data were presented, and how this was packaged into a practical recommendation as well as a recommendation for future research. So with that, I'm going to stop. I think I'm going to make my hosts happy because I'm not going overtime. I'm stopping with a few minutes left. And so I just want to thank you for your joining us, your attention, and if there's questions, I'm happy to try and answer them. Thank you.